Art is a way, I think, of taking the human world and restoring it to a bigger reality.
Welcome to Infinite Conversations, a podcast about art and life. My name is Marco V. Morelli, and my guest in this episode is the author and filmmaker J.F. Martel. We're talking about his latest essay, titled Consciousness in the Aesthetic Imagination, which we just posted in our new online journal, Metapsychosis. I've been thinking about some of JF's ideas since I first encountered his work about a year ago in the web magazine Reality Sandwich, where he published an essay that rang like a bell for me, called Beauty Will Save the World. Later, I studied his book, Reclaiming Art in the Age of Artifice, a treatise, critique, and manifesto, which I highly recommend, published by North Atlantic Books. Then a few months ago, we got to meet in person at an event in Boulder called Art Party, hosted by Stuart Davis, where JF was a featured guest and I performed a poem called The War of Art. So we're into art, but what does art really mean? What is art really? What does it do and how does it work? More to the point, what can art mean in a world deluged by what JF calls artifice, which we experience all the time in the ubiquity of marketing, design, ideology, propaganda, clickbait, and the news? What is the power of art to affect us and shock us out of whatever consensus trance we happen to be in? What are we really concerned with when we make or experience art? This is a very special talk for me because the purpose of art is central to my whole project. The podcast, the journal, the book club, and the platform we're building called A Theory of Everybody, where the core question is, how can art reimagine the world? So I hope you enjoy this talk and that you'll check out JF's latest essay on metapsychosis.com and join the conversation. You can sign up for free on our forum at infiniteconversations.com and dive in. Ready? Here we go.
All right, sorry.
That's cool. Gave me a chance to look at the artwork that you put in the folder to include with your piece. I wanted to look at the Vermeer piece specifically because I was just reading about it in your paper that you submitted to Metapsychosis Journal. The paper is called Consciousness in the Aesthetic Imagination. And it's related to your book, Reclaiming Art in the Age of Artifice. And so, I just read it and was mulling it over and wanted to look at the Vermeer painting because you talk about these three rifts that you discern in the painting, or that, you are, I think, building on scholarship on, what makes a work of art more than just a kind of intellectual curiosity, like what actually makes it still a vibrant and living, being in the world. So I thought maybe we could start the conversation just by talking about, what we can use this painting as an example. What are these rifts of art, and how is art a rift, in our experience and in the world?
Well, the rift is an idea that I try to develop in Reclaiming Art in the Age of Artifice, and I mean, it's a short chapter and it's a short part of the chapter, but the idea is to try to point to one of the factors that make a work of art more than just a representation of objects in the human world. It tries to get us outside just the world of mental representations, the world of utility, the world of useful objects,
like everyday life, default mode consciousness.
Exactly. To get us out of that and into to a deeper stratum of the real. So one of the things I've noticed studying art and practicing it and stuff, when I look at a really, really great work of art, there's always something about it that distinguishes it from other works that are there's always an imperfection in it. There's something that's a little off, and you see this in sculpture. There's just something about it that would make this an impossible posture in a real human being, but that really makes the humanity of the posture kind of spring out at you when it's done in this kind of awkward, imperfect way. And often in films, when you really study a film, you'll notice all these continuity errors that are necessary for the film to work. at the level that it works at. So I call these little imperfections or flourishes or kind of like gaps of logic or little things that make a work of art different or singular. I call those rifts. And they're what distinguish great works of art that I call classics. And I just don't, when I say it's a dangerous term because I don't mean just the classics. In fact, probably a lot of things called classics are probably maybe not that great or not that revelatory compared to...
You mean it like just technically, objectively, a classic by some like criteria that transcends like just cultural assumptions?
I mean it literally, that it's something that transcends a class and belongs in its own class, creates its own class. It's like Walter Benjamin said, you can't revolutionize a genre without reinventing a genre. So a classic is literally a work of art that does not belong to the class from which it historically emerged, but creates its own class. And it's like a kind of play on words, I guess, because in that sense. So
like it's emergent.
Yeah.
Like it's not representative of a type.
Exactly.
But by virtue of being so, it also creates a rift in our normal experience of reality.
Exactly.
And that rift reveals, as I'm understanding your piece, what you call the real.
Yeah, it's the rift in the work makes the work itself a rift, which opens a rift in our minds when we encounter it. And through the rift, we perceive for just a second, we perceive the real. And it's funny because on the other hand, like the real is what we inhabit all the time. We're always in the real. The real is just the world as it is. But we're constantly projecting our own opinions, concepts onto that world. And then we kind of inhabit a kind of projection or virtual reality that we create in order to hide, the real, because the real is scary. And we want to live in a world that's homey, comfortable, that aligns with our intentions and our plans. Whereas, of course, we're on this tiny speck of dust flying at thousands of miles per hour across the universe. We can't be in touch with that objective reality every moment, or else we wouldn't be able to get much done. But then again, what we do get done and what we do in the everyday also belongs to the real. So it's a tricky concept, but it's like art is a way, I think, of taking the human world and restoring it to a bigger reality. So that it's not about obliterating the human world and replacing it with a kind of scientific objective vision or a kind of idealist Zen-like oneness or anything like that. It literally is about taking the human world and saying this human world is just part of a bigger world, which is itself not inherently human. So that's kind of the weird trick. And that's why you'll have a rift, a kind of a very weird rift in a work of art that really depicts an everyday scene from bourgeois life in the Netherlands, 500 years ago. It's just a normal, typical, mundane scene. But when you look at it, there's something strange about it. And that little strange something about it kind of draws you in and makes you see more than just a kind of snapshot of everyday life. It's a snapshot of the real.
Mm-hmm. It's interesting because like the artwork, it does something with respect to the real. And one way I might talk about that is that it concretizes it. But the word concretize, I'm taking it from Jean Gebser, who we read in book club this winter, and I've always thought that the word is too hard, that it connotes concrete and like something that's very solid, whereas that's not exactly the case. It's because we don't experience anything in a solid way. Of course, if you smack your head into concrete, you'll experience that in a solid way. But when we're talking about perceptions or experiences, there is this discontinuous aspect to them, right? And the work of art concretizes an experience, like in the sense of, it seems like constructing some kind of like node of, I don't know what to call it exactly. But it's some kind of it's a rift and it's an opening, but at the same time, it has it's like a constellation. right?
Exactly.
Gigster used another term, right? It's a constellation of sensations like colors or sounds or words on a page or on a screen that have, a sound to them and, a visual, aspect to the letters. So I guess what I was trying to get at was that, like, the way that you use the term the real has to be subsumed within your own understanding of the term, right? So that it's not becoming like solidified into a philosophical concept, but is itself be like part of the flux that you can play with as a philosopher.
Yeah. I think you're absolutely right about art concretizing the real, in the sense that, the way I look at it is that our ordinary modality is one in which we see ourselves as outside of reality looking into it. So this is when we concretize our own subjectivity as being transcendent to the world around us, so that the world appears to exist outside of us and for us, and we sense a really real barrier between the inside of our minds and the outside world. But in fact, there is this barrier is the veil that art lifts. So let's say you're looking at, like the other example I use in it is Van Gogh's sunflower paintings. So whereas a technical diagram or technical illustration will just represent the sunflower, a kind of generic specimen that we can then use to identify sunflowers in the world, Van Gogh's just getting the sunflower as a singular, momentary, spontaneous encounter. So in other words, his experience of the sunflower and the sunflower itself constitute a single block outside of subjective experience, a single event in the unfolding of the real. And that's what art tries to capture. What it does is it folds your subjective impression of something back into the event, so that both exist on the same plane. Both exist as part of what Deleuze calls a block of sensation. So that in itself that's the kind of node or the kind of concretized moment that is captured and preserved in the work of art. Van Gogh as a subject is gone, he's dead, but his experience remains as so long as the painting holds together. So that's kind of the idea that art, Deleuze also says art preserves. He says art is the only thing in the world that preserves anything. It's the only way to preserve reality without subsuming it or without losing it in representations or kind of just pictures of,
Yeah. I'm thinking about like what's really preserved. So on page 1 in your paper, you're talking about Samuel Barber's Adagio for Strings. You give that as your first example. And then in the third paragraph, you say that genuine art isn't representational, but demonstrational and imitative. It is deeply implicated in the experiential dimension, all that we associate with consciousness. But whereas in most contexts we approach consciousness discursively from an assumed outside perspective, works of art catch it from within, in medias res. What art gives us is consciousness in action, not consciousness of the world, but consciousness in the world. And then here on the next page, under the picture of Van Gogh's sunflowers, you're talking about this difference between representation, which captures an abstract kind of, sunflower in general, and art, which captures the uniqueness of this particular sunflower, right? But it captures it and it preserves it, like you're saying, like in something which itself becomes its own uniqueness, right? And that's the interesting thing. Is like that sunflower. If there was a sunflower, I mean, whatever that was that Van Gogh may have based his work on, like that will be completely gone, rotting, returned to dirt. But the picture itself is with us. What's interesting though is when the picture gets reproduced, it's something unique, which becomes very repetitive. It's such an iconic picture, and so if we begin to treat the work of art as not a portal, not a node, but like another just representation, then we actually lose we lose a relationship to what's being preserved, right? And that kind of gets into then your distinction in your book reclaiming art between art and artifice, because a work of art could be a portal. It could be a living, rift, but it could also be just an abstracting kind of generalization that stands between you and the real, depending on how it's really deployed in your experience. Yeah. So I wonder if you could talk a little bit about your book and the basic premise of it.
Well, in this particular context, there's a part in the book where I talk about the power to be affected. Like, we live in a world, and this kind of can give us a nice entry point maybe into it. We're so bombarded with images today, with advertisements, messages of all sorts, designed, constructs, commodities, whatever. We're so bombarded that we learn very quickly to numb ourselves so that we're not completely, like, if we cried at every commercial we saw, we'd be just like an emotional wreck. Or if we were deeply affected by every representation of a field of flowers we saw on billboards, we learn to ignore the content of these images, even though they work on us unconsciously, or else if they didn't, then advertising would not exist. They work on us unconsciously, but we learn to numb ourselves to them at the conscious level. So we're just kind of working through the world, and then we're not even aware that we're falling for these advertisements and we're buying these products for reasons we have no say in whatsoever. We just kind of go along. But we're not being affected consciously but we try not to be. So it's very hard in a society like that to weep at the sight of Van Gogh's sunflowers, which you're seeing for the 1,000th time on some bathroom wall. But I had a particular experience with a Van Gogh, actually, where my mom went to France a few years ago, and she when she came back, she went to the asylum where Van Gogh was interned, where he spent some of his final days. And she gave me a coffee mug that she got at the asylum, the former asylum, a coffee mug with the final painting, the only painting he ever sold, I believe, which was the final when the crows kind of flying out over a cornfield. It's a beautiful painting. And I've never seen it in the flesh. I've only seen representations in books and online and whatnot. But that time it was on my coffee mug, and when I took the mug out, it suddenly hit me. I saw the painting for the first time, because it was the last thing I expected to see on this coffee mug. It was his kind of like death painting that he made. And when I saw it on this ridiculous coffee mug, I finally saw it, and I got really emotional. I kind of felt, and I knew the story behind the painting too, to be fair, but I felt the full impact of that moment, and I saw those crows flying. And to this day now, I can't see that. I use that mug every day, and it always kind of, so it took me, I wasn't expecting it, so it affected me. And we all have moments like that where suddenly something affects us, a fence post the paint is peeling off in a weird way, or a flock of birds just taken off suddenly as we take a walk, or something, a movie we see that just goes through our defenses and gets us somehow. So it's really sad that we've lost this power to be affected. I find when I read letters of people, written by people in the 19th or 18th century, I can't believe how much these people felt, how much they allowed themselves to feel emotions and how they expressed these emotions. I find that, I think it was partially deliberate to numb us like this. I think it's in so their vested interest in this. And I think that we have everything to gain by reclaiming our power to be affected and not seeing, we tend to see affection as a kind of like, if you're affected by something, you're a sucker, you've fallen for it. If you're too impressed by a work of art, you're just being manipulated by the artist, or you're falling for it. And there's this kind of cynical pride in not being affected by anything. And I think it's less so now than it was maybe 10 years ago. I'm feeling a shift at that level, but in a way that's what stops us from being able to experience not only works of art, but the world itself, the earth, this world, as for all that it has. To experience it directly, we lose that capacity if we're not willing to be affected by other things, if we just stay castellated in our little egos and protect ourselves from everything. So, so that's what, And that those images we're bombarded with that I was talking about earlier, that's what I call in the book, what I call artifice, which is not art, but it is, in a sense, it is art. It's aesthetic constructs that are designed to affect us in very specific ways. And, this stuff has always existed. You can think of the severed heads lining the road leading up to a castle, or the bread and games of the Romans, or the Chateau of Versailles in France, which was designed. These things were designed to impress, to be shows of power and all that. But today, with modern media, it's proliferated. So we're constantly bombarded with aesthetic forces designed to manipulate us, and these are, I claim in the book, are categorically opposed in their nature to works of art, which don't attempt to manipulate, but tend to open a space of interpretation, a space of freedom.
Martin Heidegger, in one of his essays, I don't remember whether it was the question concerning technology or his other famous essay on art, makes the distinction between techne and poiesis, I believe. I haven't read the essay in a while, so I may just be kind of mangling his thought here, which would be very unfortunate.
That's already mangled.
Nobody will know the difference anyway. But techne being, I think, what you talk about as artifice. I mean, techne is craft. It is, it's like putting something together that's practical, putting something together that works. But it has these ancient origins in the crafts and making tools and making objects for everyday use. Whereas poiesis is something more like what you mean by art. It is kind of arguably the wellspring, or one of the wellsprings of art. It's the rift that you talk about, and I think that techne is what has kind of evolved into basically this mental rational world, that we exist in, or where we exist in all the worlds, right? But we locate our identity in this particular in this particular plane, right? All these other dimensions are active, and they're operative. You're still sensing everything. You're still feeling like something. You're still feeling what's going on, and still is deeply affected and deeply cares. But because we locate our identity in the mental, and because the mental seems to have this predilection for abstraction, and it doesn't just seem to, it does. I mean, that's, but it could be many things. There's many, good things that mental technical consciousness does, but at the same time, it has to sort of, in order to kind of do what it does, it sort of has to guard against feeling anything too strongly, because feeling things disrupts those sort of orders that you establish in thought, and agreements that you make about what reality is. And particularly in a time, I think, when we're living, when there's so much pressure to operate, to get work done, to navigate the economy,
brand yourself.
Yeah, exactly. Well, yeah. Okay, that's a whole nother topic, but it's all related. I mean, partly because this kind of neoliberal, politically speaking, there's this neoliberal movement from the 80s, and partly because, at least in the United States, of the breakdown of a lot of social supports, or the conflicts around what our society can provide to help us not be so stressed. We're in this sort of survivalist mode, and we have to use our minds excessively and obsessively, and we have to guard against feeling. And then art comes along and it sensitizes us. But we could also relate to that art in a way that desensitizes us, right? I could sit down and binge on Netflix, for 10 hours a day for, a long weekend, and I could be kind of entering into this world of aesthetic experience, right? And I could even be watching some really great, awesome TV, but I'm actually not experiencing art in your definition, right? And then at the same time, I mean, I'll just mention this one thing. It's like I've had the experience of watching like something as mundane and stupid and ridiculous as like a television commercial for, you know, pharmaceutical drugs, and it's just something about the music or something about the moment. And I can't, you know, in the moment I might be able to kind of talk about what it was, but a commercial, you know, so not meant to be a profound work of art. And then something about it just affects me, and I start getting weepy. You know, maybe that's a hormonal thing, but I think it's not that. I mean, that's just a way of explaining it away. I mean, what it actually is that certain ways that we just interface, you know, with reality, break through or kind of peek through those mental encasings that, you know, would keep us from the experience of really being alive. And I think that's what art is really about. So yeah.
I think that, I mean, my book is a manifesto, so it's making a big statement and then kind of defending it. At the same time, I do caveat at the end of the chapter that, you know, you can't just create these two categories, art, artifice, and then put things in bin 1 or bin 2 according to some, you know, theory. Obviously, everything's it's all a lot more complex and subtle than that. But I just thought it was a useful way of looking at the aesthetic. And but of course, I've been affected by commercials as well. Who hasn't really? I mean, in fact, I avoid them because I'm so easily affected by them. But one way that and also there are different levels of work of art. There are. I think that we need to be able to talk about art like it's something objective. I do believe that's necessary, or else we're not talking about anything. So, in that case, we need to talk about the effective power of this or that work of art. We have to recognize that it's not for nothing that Hamlet remains as powerful now as it was 500 years ago. There's something about it. There's something about these Greek tragedies. There's something about Citizen Kane. There's something about these works that make them what they are. So we have to look for what is it, this objective thing. But of course, we can't find a recipe because each of these things is a complete singularity. And that's partially exactly what makes them so unique, is that they break through their time into this, what Nietzsche called the untimely. You know, not the eternal, but the something that is always happening. You know, a kind of it's a myth in a sense. It attains a level of the mythological or the mythic.
Gabser called it the time free or the achronon, and it's exactly this. It's perception or it's consciousness beyond the mental rational, and inclusive of what he saw as other structures of consciousness, like the magic and the mythic and all the senses, because all those structures of consciousness, you know, interact with our senses and kind of structure them, basically structure our experience. But the achronon or the untimely, like that is the rift, right? And I guess, you know, one interesting thing for me about your book was that as a manifesto and as this kind of call to action, right? I mean, that's the subtitle, A Treatise, Critique, and Call to Action. It's really about like how we relate to art, right? All the art is there, you know? I mean, there's more art than we could possibly experience, you know, in many lifetimes. I mean, that's you know, one of the amazing things about being alive now is that there's just such a profusion of it, you know, and at the same time, there's so much of it that like we see less of it in a kind of, you know, perverse sense. And, you know, I felt like you don't exactly go here in the book, but I felt like there's some like religious dimension to this. Like there's some faith or path, and it's not defined in religious terms exactly. You know, it's not like I mean, some people like will relate to the canon, what's called the canon, the Western canon, or the classics in its conventional, you know, in the conventional use of that term, as being a kind of church, you know, like a church of literature, or a church of art. but the real church of art, doesn't have any walls. And at the same time, like when something is holy, it's holy, and you recognize that, like if you're attuned to the spirit, and that makes you like a member of this this timeless or time-free communion.
Yeah, absolutely.
And it's like sometimes I feel very alone in that sort of orientation. And I think part of it is what you've been talking about, is like the commodification of art, and the way that the way that like artifice is so colonized our lives, right? You can't turn anywhere without there being some kind of design on your being, right? And I use that word design kind of deliberately there, like it's designed and it has this aesthetic to it, but it also has a design and has like intentionality to it. And of course, that intentionality is coming from human subjectivity. It's not necessarily just coming, out of the blue, but human subjectivity itself is coming out of something.
Yeah.
So, you kind of like do this recursive kind of loop, into like causes of causes, and you come to, there's still a layer of it which is. I find like hostile, is actually hostile and actually restrictive to this kind of radical openness of the church, the church of art. It wants your faith in like narrower churches, it wants you like inside of particular channels, particular walls, because it's part of a money system, and it's part of political power. And,
it always ends up reinforcing the mental, rational that you're talking about. I mean, that's what artifice. If you look at design, I don't think you do either. We don't want to damn design itself as such. Design is amazing. Design is great. Design is necessary. But there's a lot of design. For example, obsolescence engineering. The designed obsolescence of objects, so that they stop functioning after a certain time, so that you buy more. Well, that's a built-in subjective experience. The artifice is always predicated on the experience of a subject that is in a world that is separate or isolated from that world, that is alienated, right? And that's what Marx talks about, capitalism and alienation. You're alienated, you're atomized, you're a little consumer in this big world of commodities, and then you have to do certain things. You have to jump through certain hoops to get certain commodities, and it's kind of this Pac-Man game. And artifice, as such, is always trying to reinforce that feeling of subjectivity, and hence also subjection, to be subjected to, to be a subject. There's the subject in the modern rational philosophical sense, and then there's a subject in the old monarchical sense. You are a subject of a hegemony or of higher power, and you have to subject yourself to that. So there's always that ideology at work in modern artifice, and that's exactly what I would argue is absent in art. That it doesn't reinforce a feeling of alienating subjectivity, but opens up an intersubjectivity between the work and the viewer, and between the author and the viewer through the work, but also between the world and the human at a deeper level, so that the human recognizes itself. Paul Klee said that art teaches us that man is a creature on a star among stars, not the sun at the center of the universe that gives life, the shepherd of being, is Heidegger would have put it, not the Cartesian ego that perceives extension from its own transcendental viewpoint or transcendent viewpoint, not the Kantian subject that contains in itself the categories through which the universe comes into being, but that the humans, we are bodies and souls in the universe, in a universe that transcends us. So it's a humbling thing that art does, and that's very different from what artifice and all this design is trying to do.
In your paper, you say that aesthetic vision apprehends the entire universe as an immanent field living forces. All of reality is ensouled, willful, alive. It is no surprise then that works of art present the world as innately sentient. And then you go on to talk about panpsychism and this idea that consciousness is everywhere. Like, it's not limited to your transcendental viewpoint or your Cartesian ego or your monarchic subjectivity. It's everywhere, and it's interesting because that's a really like non-dual point of view, right? And there is, of course, like a sense of an artist. Just because consciousness is everywhere doesn't mean that you totally lose your sense of centeredness in a body and in a perspective. But that is not a fixed thing, and that's part of this kind of flux that's arising and churning and turning over. And part of, I think, like the life of the artist and sort of the life of the faith of art, if you will. And I want to talk more about this sort of sense of art as a religion, because I want to that needs like a lot of qualification, just kind of unpacking. Like, I don't want to get into trouble with that, but like that path has to do, I think, with like letting that flow really move through you and letting yourself be affected by it such that things become intense. And then you shape those intensities almost out of necessity, out of like psychic necessity, like into objects that can kind of capture and preserve them, and let you share them with others. All right, like let you establish a line of community, a line of connection, a line of and it's interesting because I mean that may be part of why the artwork is like a rift and why it's a singularity. Like, it does set things apart, and it does, I think a lot of artists feel isolated in their work, but it's through their work that they reestablish connection. And it's like they have to go be outside of outside of like consensual, conventional, reality, and become very alone. But then through their work, they can experience this communion, this community, and that's, I think, one of the really beautiful things about it. So anyway,
I agree. I think that. Well, okay. So the panpsychism non-dual thing. Yes, I do believe that art points to a kind of non-duality. However, it's a non-dual. I don't want to, but it's a non-dual multiplicity. It's not a non-dual oneness that you'll find in like Advaita or certain schools of mysticism. It's not like, the sunflower is just an appearance to Brahman, and my subject, my ego, is just an appearance, and it's all just diluted or diffused in this oneness. Art makes you feel lonely. Even Buddhist art or Hindu art, when you go into a temple, you feel small. You feel confronted by this temple, by these statues, by this art. And art makes you feel lonely. And the loneliness is the fact that you are a being on a star among stars, that the non-dualism is not a unifying non-dualism, but a seething, teeming multiplicity of objects and beings arising at once, and that you feel the separateness and the unity you feel with the object is that you're both separate from one another, and you exist in these lonely, there's this sense of singular, everything is singularized. So
I think that's important because it makes art actually not a religion in a traditional sense. And there's different kinds of expressions of religion, right? But like there's a sense of religion that involves kind of enforcing or maintaining like a communality based on a fixation of concepts, right? So a particular worldview or a particular cosmology that is the metaphysics that defines the real, right? Whereas in the work of art, it could be the sunflower itself is the real.
Yeah.
Like, it's not a stand-in for the real. No. It's not an expression of the real. It's not Brahman, overflowing into samsara, to mix up religions on that. But it's basically like it's a direct transmission.
Yeah.
And I think that's like that's really the really interesting part about it. And I think and the part that makes it a multiplicity and not a unity.
Exactly.
And at a certain point, the words become very useless, because you have to kind of just go to the work, and talking about it doesn't really kind of cut it. Talking about it keeps you, or kind of brings you back into the mental, rational sphere, and into the realm of of religion in its sort of deficient sense, and it's sort of, because there's religion also as art, right? Like you could, metaphysics is a kind of form, could be a form of art. I mean, it could be a divine form of art, but you'd have to relate to it that way, and that's, I think, part of like what I think your book and your work is pointing to, is that like we have to become capable of art. Like we're not automatically, artists.
No.
We're not automatically know how to appreciate it, and it's not that we can kind of, just learn it. I mean, there's like a technical skill. I mean, there's a kind of change in our being that has sort of like a conversion, like almost, some like turning to wanting to, like letting it be,
I think there needs to be a problem, You don't do anything in any real meaningful sphere activity, whether it's art or philosophy or science or hunting, if you're into hunting, or whatever. There needs to be a problem. We need food. I need to work this out. What is this problem this question keeps haunting me philosophically, whatever. There's a need. There needs to be an urgency, and I think that's true about artistic creation too. There needs to be this urgency to get something right or get through something, and that urgency is more than just a kind of like, it's not something on your day, on your agenda. Okay, today at 3:00 I'll have an existential problem and I'll produce a poem. It has to come up at a deeper level, and that's the religious. That's that level. What Paul Tillich calls ultimate concern. It has to be a question of ultimate concern. So, want it or not, no matter what your personal beliefs are, you're an atheist, you're a Christian, you're a Muslim, whatever. You're being motivated by that confrontation with the radical mystery, with this, and it's manifesting itself through this particular problem. How do I get these? Like Cézanne and that mountain he painted like million times, or Van Gogh has many paintings of sunflowers. There was something about sunflowers that just got him, and he had to get it. He had to get that monstrosity that he was seeing onto the canvas. He had to, so there needs to be, and that in itself is not, you're in the realm of what psychologists call obsession, but what poets called inspiration. So you're in that religious realm. And I do think that there's another thing I wanted to say is that religions are made out of art. And this is, I think I briefly mentioned this in the book, but if you go to a Catholic mass, I'm Catholic, I grew up Catholic, so that's what I'm familiar with. You go to a Catholic mass, what do you find? You find drama. There's some would say it's a very boring drama, but there is a drama. The passion is reenacted at every mass, the Eucharist. There's architecture, there's sculpture, there's music. If you take the art out of the Catholic mass, there's literally nothing left except dogmatic, judgment. And even that, that's gone if you see the art first. So, and it's the same with Buddhism, or it's. Religions are first and foremost works of art, and then everything happens after that.
I was surprised when I learned that Salvador Dali had really become devout Catholic, at a certain phase in his life. And then I kind of just shifted, because I grew up Catholic as well, and I got bored going to church, and I totally lost interest in Catholicism. But that was one of the things when I thought about like what would be so compelling to, this great artist that I admired, in this religion that I had, given up on. I recognized, it's so richly artistic. I mean, it's so profound, it's so just overflowing with deeply felt expressions of, or artworks based out of ultimate concern, and that is, that is, I think, part of all religions, because just all the effort, the energy it takes to put together a religion, like there has to be some really good reason for it. There has to be something holding together. It's not just political control. It's the fact that that we are so small, and that we are going to die, or dying, or already dead in some way, and that there is an infinite mystery that confronts us, like in just the bare fact of existing, and then we start making art, and we start then we start concretizing that, and then we turn it into an organization. We have profits and so forth, but there's still an original prophecy and an original encounter with that mystery of being, like, just in the art itself. And that's that's as I understand your argument, like the source, out of which all these other manifestations take shape.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that I had a similar experience with Catholicism. I grew up Catholic. I was very devout as a child, and then I threw it off completely when I was a teenager. But throughout my 20s, I maintained an interest in the aesthetics of it, and I would often find myself defending it to people who were kind of offhand, like attacking it in pubs and stuff. And then when I was about 30, I came back to it, like full on. I read some things, and I saw some stuff, and I had access to a church that was very progressive and very different. And I started going back. Now I've fallen off the wagon again, but I maintain this kind of respect for the Catholic tradition, this is a very, very strange thing to say today. It's amazing how I'm French Canadian, and in French Canada, the Catholic Church is anathema. Nobody cares. Like it's been completely thrown to the side. So, but I can't help it. I see the beauty of it, and I see the beauty of the mythology and the poetry, and I see the meaning. So, yeah, and Dali wasn't the only one. All those decadents, those late 19th century decadents, a bunch of them, like Oscar Wilde. I can't think of Aubrey Beardsley. I think they all went back to Catholicism, or went to it.
That was one of the Oscar Wilde's book. You reference it in Reclaiming Art. Not his book. He wrote an essay called "The Soul of Man Under Socialism," but it's also an essay about being a Christian, and it's been probably 25 years since I read it, but he wrote it when he was in prison. Right? He was imprisoned partly for being gay, and he wrote this beautiful essay that is really kind of this fusion of the sort of aestheticism that Wilde is known for, with this deep Christianity and this political vision, of a human family, a human family where, in his book, he imagined a time when, we had technology and robots taking care of like everything, and we could just kind of work, minimally, but we would use our ingenuity to actually create a world that lets us have more aesthetic experience, more experience of life in its full, radiance. And that was his vision. And it really ties together if you step outside of either of those frames, either the aestheticism, which kind of would reduce things to an art world, and to the commodification of art, and to the, just kind of the experience that doesn't have a moral dimension, or if you just, abide in the religious, or if you just abide in the political, like, I think that what the genius of Wilde and of artists that are sui generis, right? That, like you said, like they create their own class. They transcend conventional conventional genre and conventional notions of what art even is that they bring all these dimensions, together, and all the dimensions are like operative, like in their work, right? And that's what you started pointing out, to circle back in the Vermeer painting, is that it's not simply a moralistic allegory, right? It has it sort of deconstructs itself, right, by the very thoughtful placement of objects, and the presence of the painting on the wall, and the absence of jewelry in the scales, and these other things that you point out in your paper, which I would encourage people to read, and so, like, although it would present itself as a work of art, or it would present itself as even a religious work of art, when you actually sit with it and experience it and look at it, spend time with it and study it and talk to people about it, it reveals other aspects of itself that resist being categorized or classified or abstracted into mere concepts.
Exactly. Yeah, and there's this self-renewing power in it that in 200 years people will get stuff out of Vermeer we can't access now. Like, there's just when I was thinking about this talk, we were talking about discussing how can art make actual change in the world, how can art have actual power, and it occurred to me, I was thinking of Hamlet and going, well, if we took Hamlet out of history, what would have changed? And in one sense, we can't really know what exactly would be different. It's not like if we say, if Marx hadn't written Capital, what would have changed? Well, we can actually quantify a lot of things that would have changed. There wouldn't have been, Lenin wouldn't have come about, or certain things would have taken a drastically different form. But if you take Hamlet out, well, what changes? Well, in a sense, nothing, and in a sense, everything, because it obviously affected so many people on such a deep level that there's no real way to quantify what it brought to the world. So art works on that level of the untimely, that level, the imaginal level, the level that's outside of the sensory motor chain of events that constitutes capital H history. It operates on another level, and it intervenes into history, and I also thought, okay, well, we don't even know what Hamlet will do in the world, because we don't know what Hamlet will become to the generations in the future. Because if it's survived this long, there's no, the only thing that could kill Hamlet is the total illiteracy of our culture. And that's being done. There's being made. A bunch of illiterate people could get Hamlet in the 16th century, in the early 17th. They could watch it and get it. Today, most people, it would just go right through. They wouldn't even understand a single freaking word, and that is worrisome. That's not a jab at Hamlet. That's our problem,
Well, maybe after the singularity, when there's some sort of super intelligence, the AI will go back and reread Hamlet and discover all new possibilities in it.
Yeah.
Well, there's this book called Ilium by Dan Simmons, and it's a sci-fi book. Takes place like 3,000 years in the future, and there's this there's kind of this population of super advanced beings, like total, like the nanotechnology, robotic, AI networked, that quantum computing. I mean, it's all sort of there in the book. He throws it all in there, but they recreate Homer's Iliad, and they basically do it as the Olympian gods, like they're on Mars, but they have the powers of the Olympian gods because of their nanotechnology, right? So it's cool, and then they have all their the same conflicts as the Olympian gods, and then the book takes place between their conflicts and these people left on Earth and so forth. I don't want to get into it. It's a very cool book, But yeah, we don't know what Hamlet will do. We don't know what Homer will do. We don't know what Toni Morrison will do, or James Baldwin will do, or any true artist, because because we don't know what consciousness will do.
Yeah, exactly.
And, it's not the end of the story. And, one thing about this idea of art being kind of an incursion, like, or an intervention, like in conventional reality, I really think it is that. And, that doesn't have to have like a political intention. Like, it's something more than political. It's something more than moral. It's something more than aesthetic. But it can include all those. Don DeLillo wrote a book called Mao 2, novel, and partly it's about this reclusive writer who's kind of drawn out into the world again because there's a poet being held by a terrorist group in the Middle East, and he is he's called to somehow help, and he goes there and ends up kind of meeting his fate. But one of the things he says in the book is that terrorism has like replaced art as being like this force that changes consciousness, and the idea of that is that you have this thing that shocks you, like that shocks everybody, that changes like the way people feel and think and how societies are organized, and in the book, he's saying, or he's having the character say, that artists kind of like lost its ability to do that, partly because it's become commodified, right? It's become basically colonized and absorbed into the order of things. But I think that real art and, what do I mean by real exactly? That's another, I think we've talked a bit about that, but it still has to be a force in the world.
Yeah.
It still has to kind of shock us. It has to astonish us, as you put it.
Yeah, and I agree. I think that there's an interesting vision of art in Mao Tzu, the way you explain it. And it's what Nietzsche called, the Wagnerian vision of art for the masses, art that will change a culture, art that will create a culture or destroy a culture. That's the art that the terrorism operates at. But Nietzsche, in the end, and he kind of wavered. He was a big fan of Wagner, then changed his mind, and he ends up in a place where art works at a much more individual level. That the work of art, if you have a film shown to 2,000 people, it's affecting each person uniquely. It interacts with each person at the level of their own experience, their own memories, their own interpretations. And that would be the difference between, that vision of the art for the masses that will transform the culture and bring about this utopian age. I had long discussions with Daniel Pinchbeck when I was writing the book because he has that vision of art. And I don't. So we had this big debate by through emails about that, and that's what I think you're right, that it's apolitical. So that type of art, that terrorism type of art, or that art for the masses vision, is very political, and that's the Marxists who backed it on that basis, with that logic in mind. But the other art is apolitical, and that's the art of Wilde. When when Wilde says art is amoral, the artist is free to express anything, because what's expressing itself through him will be important to the person, to each person who comes to it. That's an apolitical vision, but its political implications are huge because it values individuality, and I don't mean that in the capitalist. I mean individuality, the singularity of a soul coming into this world, the singularity of an experience of a consciousness. And I think that there's a part where Wilde actually explicitly says this in the Soul of Man Under Socialism, where he says that art is individuality, and individuality is the only thing that's protecting us from the reduction of man to the level of a machine. And this is important. And this gets lost in a lot of the consciousness movement. We want to get out of individuality, get out of ego, get to this more like we're all together thing. But I think it's important to remember that the individual was a great discovery of the Western world. We can't just throw it out. I think we have to deal with it. We have to deal with the fact that we are individuals, and that art communicates with us at that level, that each of us must interpret it on our terms, in our story, and make sense of it. And if we think that way, that the political implications of that are huge, because it's nonconformist. It goes against a lot of it's kind of immunization against artifice and against type of like just following along with the flock and everything Nietzsche was railing against. So there's something there, it's apolitical, but that makes it very political.
Yeah. That's interesting, actually. Like I didn't really pick up on that as much, like the idea of art as a sort of thing that could affect the culture, sort of be a mass. See, DeLillo wasn't. I mean, it's interesting. He was talking about terrorism as being like kind of replaced art as this force in culture, yes. Right? But in another sense, what is kind of implied by that is like consumerism being a force, because we know that like Beyonce could put out an album, right? Make a whole bunch of videos in secret, and then, assemble this mass marketing machine to kind of just drop it on the world, and like suddenly, boom, everybody's talking about it, and it's on HBO, and, she's making millions of dollars, and like she's getting people talking at the same time too, because she's putting stuff in there like New Orleans and Hurricane Katrina and the shooting of black teenagers, and stuff that makes a lot of people feel uncomfortable, because it looks like she's making political statements, and those are statements that might offend their sensibilities, right? And so it's like, I think that like that's one example of like art on this mass scale, right? Where there's actually like this real political reality, which is racism, in the United States and America, and its kind of continued existence in these events that we're seeing, and the stratification of society, and like all the kind of microaggressions and the real, economic injustices, and, prison industrial conflict. I mean, it goes on and on and on. And she's putting that stuff in her art. And at the same time, she's doing the, mass commodification. She's like she's got a sponsorship with Pepsi, which, selling sugar water. And so she's totally, in the capitalist world, and at the same time transcending it. And that's what I find is like one of the really interesting things, right? Is that art and artists, like when they emerge, like out of just being like the pop diva, like this kind of category, this commercial category, into being an artist, suddenly it's like you can turn around and then use the machinery of capitalism to subvert it, if that's what she's doing. I mean, I don't know all the implications of it, and I think that there's probably arguments to be made on either side, but I in my perception, like, that's real art.
Yeah.
That's actually like real art, and it's masterful art at that. And so then on the other hand, though, like this way that art works like intimately and quietly, where like an Emily Dickinson poem could have just as much an effect on me as Lemonade, her Beyonce's, latest music video. That's interesting too, and that may be, for the sake of my life and my actual experience, like the defining event. That may be what kind of changes everything. So it's all very mysterious.
It is.
And beautiful. And I'm going to let you kind of, have your last words, but what I really appreciated about your book is that it sort of it's articulating, I think, an understanding of how we can relate to art, whether we identify as artists or not, in a way that lets it affect us with its like originary and primordial power, and actually lets it change our lives. And I think that's huge, and I think you've articulated it beautifully.
Thank you. Yeah. Thanks. It's the whole question of using the machine to subvert the machine. And it's a really interesting one, and there's obviously no easy answer. It's obviously a dangerous game, but maybe it's a game that, I think that there have been artists who've done it and won. I think Shakespeare, a lot of his plays had direct political implications with the monarchy at the time and everything. I think Kubrick was an example of a filmmaker who kind of harnessed the machine and used it to create great works of art. And it'd be great to live in a society that gave a place to art so that the machine could serve that. That's kind of Oscar Wilde's dream. But I haven't. I'm going to check out the Beyonce video now that you've mentioned it.
Yeah, and I myself am not imagining that I'll ever get that great at using the machine. So that's even though I'm praising that, and I'm kind of marveling at how Beyonce's done that, or Prince, or David Bowie. Yeah. Two figures that are really present in our awareness at this time. Or Kubrick, or Shakespeare. My own strategy is more to withdraw from the machine as much as possible and start to create new ways of doing things, I hope, at least in my small context. Yeah. And I think actually that's the future. I think that actually kind of in the long run, the game of consumption and this kind of mindless repetition of just kind of commercial culture, it just becomes boring, and you start to connect the dots, and you realize that it's actually just part of this huge machine of extraction that is trying to maximize its hold on your time, attention, money, and ultimately in some real demonic sense, your soul. And to free your soul, you have to kind of free yourself from your dependence on and your implication in that matrix of relationships. But that's not easy to do. I mean, I don't know anybody who's really done that materially speaking.
Neither do I.
You got to start in the interiors, and start on subtle levels, and start in your relationships, and start in your day-to-day life, and and I think then we could start working on actually materially changing.
Something needs to happen. Whether it's going to be done for us or whether we're going to be the architects of it remains to be seen. We don't know what shape it'll take. But it's becoming pretty obvious that it's coming apart, and as an artist, as someone who thinks about, it's a tricky time to be in, because it's really hard to navigate the landscape or to place yourself. We all have to promote ourselves on social media. We all have to do all this work that ultimately just takes time away from creating, and it's a tricky time, but there's that Chinese curse, may you live in interesting times. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Well, I think we're all cursed. We're living in very, very interesting times.
Well, I'm happy to be alive, at least today.
Yeah, same here. Same here.
Infinite Conversations is a project of A Theory of Everybody, a platform for social poetics and planetary thought. In addition to this podcast and podcast network, we're also working on a number of other projects, including an online journal of consciousness and culture called Metapsychosis, an unusually hardcore book club called Lit Geeks, and a discussion hub tying these all together at infiniteconversations.com, where you can join the conversation. We offer all this freely in the spirit of the gift, and you can learn more and support our work at theoryofeverybody.com. Once again, this is Marco V. Morelli. Thanks for listening.